Hello everyone, I'm Anna Hurwitz. This talk is called Fighting the Devil, Disability Rights and Animal Rights Under Capitalism. So the title Fighting the Devil refers to a quote from one of my personal revolutionary heroes, Helen Keller. She was a deafblind woman who many people know as a child. Her story portrayed in The Miracle Worker, but what many people don't know is that as an adult she championed the global struggle against capitalism and women's liberation also as an activist with the Socialist Party of America and the Radical Labor Union, the Industrial Workers of the World. So the full quote is, see, I have it right here. It is wonderful how much time good people spend fighting the devil. If they would only expend the same amount of energy loving their fellow, the devil would die in his own tracks of ennui. And I think that this acknowledges one of my personal lessons that I've taken away as a revolutionary. Our movements for change need to be driven by great feelings of love, as Chase said. Even more than we hate the oppressor, we must be motivated by our love for the oppressed. If our activism is to be sustainable and lifelong, that is. So this presentation covers the relationship between disability rights and also animal rights as liberation movements, especially how the two can be interdependent and share a common dream of a world without capitalism. So I'm going to kind of talk about what lessons vegans can learn from the history of the disabled movement. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about animal rights activism is like as a person with a disability. How can the animal rights community be more inclusive of people with disabilities? First, I want to give some credit to Sarita Rodriguez for providing some of the ideas in this talk and helping me brainstorm. Also, I'd recommend folks read her book, Until Every Animal is Free, on vegan publishers, because it's a wonderful resource for vegans who want to build revolution for animals. So about me, I'm an organizer for the worldwide animal rights organization Direct Action Everywhere, DXE. I've written for Sista Vegan, a critical race theory blog on veganism. Folks should check out the book Sista Vegan for a compendium of black vegan voices. Over the years, I've been involved in revolutionary organizations, fighting for animal liberation, fighting for socialism, fighting for migrant justice, fighting for prison abolition, fighting for housing rights, fighting for sex worker advocacy, and climate justice. I live in Portland, Oregon, in the United States. So, when we talk about disabled people in the collective sense, we're talking about a significant portion of the US population. About 20%. That's according to the US government census data from 2010. That's about 55 million people in the United States. Around a quarter of those folks are classified as having a severe disability. So what connects the oppression of disabled people with the oppression of animals? Well, as a visually disabled person myself, I cannot speak for all folks with disabilities. I was born legally blind, and my visual acuity is 20 over 800, which is scientific speak for not so good over not so good. And the world basically looks like a blurry underwater painting. And this is why my presentation is actually in audio, not video. Anyway, when I was a teenager, I first got involved in activism, and it really wasn't until this past year, 28 years old now, that I've ever really been in an organization that's been accommodating of my visual disability. The easiest way to explain being visually disabled is that you miss a lot of things, and people assume that you're not paying attention, or that you're just not even smart. So your abilities are constantly called into question. Your leadership as an organizer is constantly called into question. And if you're a woman, that goes double. This has resulted in me being removed from organizations for things like missing protests for months at a time, for demanding accommodations, generally being perceived as a burden because of asking for um, like changes that would better assist me as a disabled person. In short, when you're disabled, you're often seen as a burden. You come to know powerlessness intimately. A lot of people ask why I'm vegan, as I'm sure a lot of people ask y'all. I suppose the reasons are many, but I perhaps first and foremost came to vegan consciousness through knowing the powerlessness of disability, and then seeing the powerlessness of animals in our world. I saw the powerlessness of disabled folks reflected in their eyes. Capitalism uses the ideological justification of individualism. Individualism says each of us is an island without any social responsibility whatsoever. That the oppressed should pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, even when we can't. Able-bodied people often believe it's easy to work hard and get ahead regardless. If you're disabled, you have little use in capitalism because as a worker you cannot produce market commodities for the owning classes, and your labor is not easily exploitable by the capitalists. Disabled folks are often unemployed because of this. We don't receive an education that's suited for our needs and abilities, and a lot of us can hardly participate at all in society. We're pushed to the margins. And on the margins, it's more likely that we will experience mistreatment at the hands of others without any justice. Even though the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, I feel like I have to say that because, every time you talk about disability oppression in a meaningful way, able-bodied people will usually say, but what about the ADA? Well, the ADA has passed many years ago, but we're still denied many basic rights. So, when political scientists refer to the disability movement, they're usually talking about the struggle which began around the 1960s in the contemporary social political context. Of course, there have been individual disability advocates farther back than the 1960s. Helen Keller, I mentioned already, Louis Braille, who developed the language of Braille that visually impaired folks could read with their fingers. Um, but one of the early contributors to the modern disability movement, at least in the sense of the disability movement as a collective social struggle in the United States, was Edward Robert, who joined with other quadriplegic, he was quadriplegic, he joined with quadriplegic and paraplegic students at UC Berkeley in California. As a child, Edward was diagnosed with polio. His whole body was paralyzed. And by the time he entered college, the political landscape of revolution in the United States, which was on the precipice, greatly influenced him to advocate for not only his needs, but the needs of his entire community. So at the time, he was living in an infirmary for disabled folks, but he joined with others to demand access to affordable and mainstream living arrangements. When these activists began to organize as a group, they pushed for further demands like classroom accessibility in educational institutions, curb accessibility, public transit accessibility, a lot of the things that we see today, which we kind of just assume have always been there, but actually people had to fight for those and win. So next time, your racist uncle tells you, as he's like dining on a turkey's body, next time he tells you that, why do you protest? Protest doesn't do anything. Almost every major change in society, as Frederick Douglass wrote long ago, power concedes nothing without struggle. All shifts in power are the result of popular struggle. And disability movement, no different. And the animal liberation movement needs to be no different. I think we're building that. The demands of the early nascent disability movement formed the organizational basis for the first Center for Institutional Living. That was in 1972. Um, Basically, as activists, uh, people with the Center for Institutional Living involved themselves in other struggles. And while American history, has a long featured nonprofit charities, like a long history of featured nonprofit charities that we hear about, which focus on the rights of different sectors of this disabled community. The Center for Independent Living was kind of unique because it was collectively run by and for disabled folks. Many nonprofits focused on kind of little beyond fundraising for treatment of disabilities. Like, they focused all their energy on just, you know, getting people to donate. Other organizations, such as the American Federation for the Blind, worked one-on-one with disabled individuals in order to better their lives. Yet, the Center for Independent Living didn't have one disability which it focused on. Instead, it touted itself as the very first organization that was, I'm going to use the term pan-disability, if you will. Basically uniting people with various disabilities under the banner of identity as disabled persons. But perhaps the most revolutionary declaration of the Center for Independent Living was its assertion that the problems facing the disabled community lay not in the individuals, but rather in society, specifically capitalism's inability to provide for the basic needs of ordinary people. I mean, they weren't using the word capitalism, but that's what they were talking about, because capitalism is a system focused on production for profit rather than organizing society around people's needs. And I say people's to include human and non-human, really. Like, life becomes expendable, life becomes commodifiable, and the basic needs of living beings are not met under capitalism. So the Center for Independent Living then influenced a number of disability activism organizations which demanded that society meet the needs of the disabled community. Some of these organizations were ADAPT, ADAPT, which I'll cover in detail in a bit. I'm going to focus a lot on that one. Also, the organizations that took influence from the CIL were Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, the DREDF, Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, People First, of course. They're the ones who were famous for popularizing the progressive idea that disabled folks are people first and disabled second. And also the organization Mind Freedom. I feel like I want to plug them. So, ADAPT may be the organization most folks are familiar with. ADAPT has been around since 1983. It was formed in Colorado, USA. The founder, Wade Blank, was previously involved in the African American Civil Rights Movement and decided to start organizing in poor communities in an attempt to move disabled people out of undesirable living arrangements and towards independent living. So ADAPT, since its inception, is focused on ways in which public transportation limits disabled people's abilities to participate meaningfully in society by just doing normal things like going to work or school. When I first became involved in socialist activism, I would often miss meetings and rallies and events because I couldn't even get there. I got lost on public transit, and this happened for years, up until even not so long ago. So ADAPT then, like DXE today, DXE being who I organized for, was inspired by the sit-ins of the 1960s. And they used nonviolent direct action to blockade buses, which were back then all wheelchair inaccessible. And they did this to call attention to accessibility for people with disabilities. And it's something that we're very aware of today, so obviously that has been an effective tactic. Other groups were inspired by this tactic that ADAPT had and similarly used nonviolent direct action to fight for disability liberation. So one of the main questions that organizers from DXE get is why direct action? Some activists believe that direct action only encompasses underground, cool, illegal activism for animals, and yeah, that is a form of direct action, but we know that the history of popular struggle actually shows that most direct action uses mass protests and popular public provocation. Well, maybe I shouldn't say popular, because when you're advocating for the rights of the oppressed, it's not very popular at first, but then it becomes the norm. So most of history has consisted of direct action, specifically looking like protests and provocation that calls attention to systems of oppression, which have persisted for far too long. DXE takes contemporary inspiration from the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and the Black Lives Matter movements, because we believe that beyond veganism as a theory and practice, animals need a social movement of revolutionary, vibrant, uncompromising activists who are willing to fight back against the system in order to win animal liberation. So, how can we apply nonviolent direct action as a tactic from the disability movement to the animal liberation movement? Sometimes I think we make the mistake of thinking that militancy does not help our movement. While it's true that often people will react to having their morality challenged and will often react negatively, what is true is that people are inspired by militancy. It fires up political bases. For example, when, let's just use the contemporary, no, I'm not going to use anything contemporary so that this speech will be timeless. I won't date myself. But yeah, like, to use the general example, when a Democratic Party candidate in the United States starts saying vaguely radical left things like everyone gets energized, and then when the Republicans act more like, orthodox fascists, then their base gets organized. Like, my point is that nobody finds lukewarm demands inspiring, and nobody finds moderate terms that those demands are made in to be inspiring. People are inspired by militancy, and therefore let's embrace our militancy. We're only as big as our dreams, and we must believe in a world where the quiet oppression of complacency is replaced by our dream of vigorous dissent, of a movement for change. We dream of a world where all the animals are free. And you know what? I feel like some folks in the animal rights movement need to realize that that's okay. It's okay to ask for animal liberation. It's okay to be militant. ADAPT is known for being the most militant group in the disability rights movement, and it's their greatest strength. I think it could be our greatest strength, too. They have a strong message, strong wording, strong imagery, and they have the courage to act on their convictions. And I really want to emphasize courage and conviction, because courage and conviction are always the drivers behind social uprisings and revolutions throughout history around the world. So here are a few examples that I'll go into. In 2009, ADAPT occupied the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. They advocated for a system-wide overhaul in long-term care for the disabled so that people would not be relegated to nightmarish living facilities just because they were disabled. So for one of the 5 days of action, disability rights advocates handcuffed and locked down to the White House. It's kind of a high-risk action. Activists decried President Obama for not having passed the Community Choice Act, a campaign promise which he made to the disabled community. 91 of these activists were taken into police custody. And on another day of action in this 5-day series of actions, ADAPT activists rallied outside of the SEIU, that's the Service Employees International Union. building in Washington, D.C. So the SEIU is the union of many workers who give long-term care to people with disabilities. Other targets of the 5 days of action included they went and protested outside Congress to urge that social services for people with disabilities were definitely included in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which aka is Obamacare. Um, so ADAPT has seen major wins in shifting social responsibility to the disabled community in the United States. ADAPT has also been persistent in using nonviolent direct action as its primary tactic to change the world. For more info on ADAPT, because I just don't have time to go into the whole history of the organization, you can check out their website. It's ADAPT, not ADAPTT. That's actually an inventory of animals who are killed for food, which is a helpful resource, but it's also kind of a not very happy resource. Anyway, as an animal liberation movement, we would all do well to explore what has made ADAPT so strong of a force in the disability rights movement. ADAPT's model of action and decision making is based on a structure very similar to the communist idea of democratic centralism. Democratic centralism is basically the organizational practice of giving all chapters of a revolutionary group plenty of space to debate and discuss issues, yet once the members have voted, everyone agrees on the outcome because they respect democracy. And so, I mean, there can be appeals processes, of course, because it's not democracy if you can't appeal the outcome, but this is different from the consensus model, is what I'm trying to say, which is where everyone has to agree. And ADAPT has shown dedication to their struggle for liberation, not just in their organizational structuring, but also in maintaining political independence. ADAPT is not tied to liberal or conservative political parties in the United States. ADAPT does not look to establishment groups to deliver its liberation, but instead believes in its own collective power. And I want to say that I'm not proposing that I think it can be not productive when we turn against establishment groups instead of keeping an open door policy and dialoguing with them, because that's how consciousness shifts, right? Like, ideas are never going to change if we don't be friends with folks and just talk to them. And, like, if an organization has problematic ideas, like, we're never going to change their minds unless we are their friends first and we can, like, discuss these things with them. So when you have that kind of cooperation, that's helpful, but also it's, important to maintain your independence as a political organization. ADAPT does not look to, like, any kind of large nonprofit to deliver its liberation. Instead, it believes in its own collective power. And this is also what helps keep ADAPT active consistently rather than focusing on politicians' campaigns and then having low points after elections are over. So, ADAPT has also struggled with certain members amassing too much power and not passing that power on to the membership and teaching other organizers how to do things. And I think our movements will be weak if we have only a few leaders. But our organizations and our movement will be strong if we have many leaders. And it'll also be much harder for law enforcement to dissolve our organizations, especially at later points in revolutionary struggle and in heightened consciousness. That's the idea of leaderless resistance. In ADAPT, women are empowered as organizers. I think we should all listen to this and work on it. All of ADAPT's membership is comprised of people with disabilities. So, this can be challenging in our movement since animals can't lead the struggle. As much as I would like to be in a movement where pigs were organizing and cows were organizing, I can't. So since they can't lead the struggle for their own liberation, they're kind of reliant on allies or co-conspirators, if you prefer that term. So ADAPT membership is multiracial and represents the voices of many racial groups. This fosters a diverse and beautiful work of cultural expression such as poetry, music, drama, and visual arts, which, our movement really needs. Like, DXE was founded by Asian immigrants, and we empower people of color, LGBTQ people, and women as organizers. A lot of folks talk about intersectionality. I think it's more important to do intersectionality. So when ADAPT does intersectionality, it looks like their protests, their music, poetry, and whatnot, all those tactics that they utilize for direct actions, not just being white all the time, not just being male, not just being straight and cisgender. And I'll argue that our organization should look at incorporating the power of cultural expressions of art into our advocacy for animals. Like, we should start using music, poetry, drama, and visual arts the way ADAPT has. I think that's a lesson from the disability movement that we could really benefit from, because art inspires people. I mean, I'm not going to insult anyone, but because I'm a Jew and I don't do that. But, just think of how many punk boys have, come to veganism through music. It's definitely a powerful recruiting tool. So anyway, ADAPT uses modern technology to promote its message on social media. We need to always be doing that. One of ADAPT's most powerful features is that it has a warm and welcoming community. I cannot stress this enough. Now, this is something our movement desperately needs. We rarely create groups that are welcoming and forgiving. In order to avoid activist burnout and to cultivate lifelong revolutionaries, people who are going to be struggling until their last breath or until every animal is free, whichever is first, our organizations of social struggle must also be our sources of family and friendship. Places where people find their partners, places where people find their best friends. That's how we recruit activists. That's how we foster activist recidivism. ADAPT has found its own fire in the disability movement by learning from social movements of the past, and this is really something that we all need to do. Notably, they've taken inspiration from the 1960s African American civil rights movement, using 3 nonviolent direct action tactics: disruptions, marches, civil disobedience. Some local actions are coordinated nationally. One example is every year they have what's called Freedom Day. It's one of their events they host on MLK's birthday, Martin Luther King's birthday. And ADAPT's been around for, at this point, well, I'm not going to do the mental math, but since 83. And because they've been around so long, they also focus on like empowering youth as leaders. We need to do that too. ADAPT even has like offshoot splinter groups. Not splinter in like what we see on the left with like organizations like saying, "Oh, you disagree about this issue. We cannot be together anymore. I will be the organization part 1, you'll be the organization part 2." Anyway, ADAPT has had offshoots that specifically address the needs of members within their community. Feminist response and disability activism, concrete change, not dead yet, That's for senior citizens. And all these were established by ADAPT activists. Many of us talk about intersectionality again without practicing it. It's much better to practice it, I think. Uh, DXE has formed offshoot caucuses organized by and for marginalized groups within its worldwide membership. For example, we have Animal Liberationists of Color, we have Women Against Speciesism, Teens Against Speciesism, and LGBTQ plus Animal Liberationists. And I'm not saying this is the only model that everyone should join this one organization. What I'm saying is that we all need to have like caucuses for marginalized groups where they can organize and kind of address the specific issues that like are pertinent to animal rights organizing. Like my friend Rafaela says all the time that we are a movement not of animals but of humans, therefore we have to make sure that our movements are tending to the needs of human rights struggles. So we have to be active participants in anti-racist movements, can't just talk about it, have to be active participants in feminist movements, can't just talk about it, youth movements, LGBTQ movements, we gotta be there, they gotta know we care. You can't fake it, and like that's something we really need to work on. I'm not saying like I do it perfectly or anything by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying these are goals. These are goals that we need to foster as a movement. So one disability activist who has authored a book called Nothing About Us Without Us, Disability, Oppression, and Empowerment, his name is James Charlton, he said that we can also take inspiration from like disabled folks can take inspiration from socialist systems such as Cuba and Nicaragua because they have massive publicly funded social services for their disabled communities. I don't see a reason why we can't have massive publicly funded social services for disabled communities in the United States and everywhere around the world. So this concludes my talk. I just want to kind of bring home the key points. Vegans need to heed the historical lessons of the disability rights movement to incorporate the tactics they've used to be actively inclusive and accommodating of disabled activists, and to familiarize ourselves with the most significant issues facing the disabled community. Thanks for listening to me talk. I love y'all. Blessings.